I've read some books about some things now, and I know more stuff. I'm more cynical. I'm more critical. How do you keep on keeping on with the glory of God fresh in your life and the love of neighbor fresh in your life? Particularly when they're maybe going through hard times and they read another story of someone that's gone through similar hard times. You said you're not alone. Absolutely. And they say, that person is almost my best friend, this fictional character. They understand me better than anybody I know.
Hi, my name is Susan Smetzer-Anderson. I am the senior writer at Upper House, an initiative of the Stephen and Laurel Brown Foundation. Today, I have the joy of talking with Byron Borger. He is the owner and manager of Hearts and Minds Books, an institution highly renowned in Pennsylvania. He loves to read, he loves books, and he has amazing recommendations for books. Today, we are actually talking about books that talk about reading. And there are some amazing books out there that help you dig deeper, go deeper, love books even more. So I hope you enjoy this time with him today. We're going to try to do this on a quarterly basis. Well, it's my sincere pleasure today to have a conversation with Byron Borger, who is the owner of Hearts and Minds Bookstore in Dallastown, Pennsylvania. And when I go onto your website, Byron, I'm just struck by the tagline of your bookstore, and it is Hearts and Minds, more than a bookstore. And what really comes through loud and clear is that you are shepherding a community of readers. And that's one of the reasons I'm so excited to talk to you. So thank you for joining me today.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Well, you are kind of a legend among the Upper House team. You probably know that, but I just like reminding you every once in a while that you are highly regarded here.
That is surprising. That is surprising to me. So good. That's fantastic.
No, I think it's because you've met several of our staff team and also have probably recommended books to a number of the people who work here. You may have even published a couple of things by people who work here, or at least sold them. So it wouldn't be surprising at all that you're well known here. But what really drew me to wanting to talk to you is that you are such a wealth of knowledge about books. And I wondered if you can give me a sense of how long you've been directing Hearts and Minds.
Well, thank you. Yeah, for those that don't know, our little bookstore is in South Central Pennsylvania. Some people have heard of Hershey, where the Hershey Kisses are made, or Lancaster, known for the Amish and a whole lot of other things.
Right.
We're just below York, Pennsylvania, one of the first capitals of the United States, by the way. The weightlifting hall of fame is here. York peppermint patties used to be here until Hershey's bought them and sent them to Mexico. And so now it's an empty factory. But yeah, we're just below York, Pennsylvania. We opened our bookstore 42 years ago. So there were hardly computers then. There was no Amazon. Chains were the big sort of competitors against indies. And of course, Amazon closed down most of the big chains, and particularly in the faith-based community, Cokesbury and Lifeway and those places, Zondervan, they all closed. And so as bookstores were just dropping like flies back 15 years ago, we were graced by God with good employees that could work cheap, and everybody just tightened our belts and we hung in there. And we've continued to develop through our newsletter that goes out every week, friends and customers. We say more than a bookstore, more than just customers, friends and colleagues throughout the country and actually throughout the world. So we send books out all over the place every single day. And we've been doing it for 40 years here in our small town. We're ecumenical, so we have a real wide customer base, left, right, and center, mainline churches, evangelical churches, Reformed folks, others. So, and people that aren't Christians at all, because, we don't even call ourselves technically a Christian bookstore. Back in the day, only certain, people went in Christian bookstores, and not even all Christians would go in Christian bookstores. So we call ourselves Hearts and Minds as a little retail shop here in Dallastown, Pennsylvania, just below York. And we've been at it for a while now, trying to figure out how to serve our local friends, churches, and nonprofits far and wide, and mostly through our mail order stuff, through this Book Notes newsletter we do, which generates interest and mail order every single day. So we're thrilled to be able to get out and about and serve people face-to-face at conferences and events, But also the mail order stuff is really, really fun. We have friends now all over the country.
Well, and I recently ordered a book by Leslie Bustard from you, and what it came with was this lovely note that you wrote. And I'm not setting you up to have to write a lovely note to every person who orders a book from you, but I just was struck by that personal touch. And that isn't something that I ever get from Amazon, quite frankly.
Well, a thing can be said about that, there's this facelessness and this sort of efficient convenience
Right.
that online shoppers have. You click something and you forget about it. But we're sort of trying to use technology in a maybe more redemptive way to sort of have the best of both worlds, hands-on, face-to-face, high-touch customer service. I have to answer every email with a little note, confirm that people that we got their order and we're going to send it out. And is it paperback or hardback? And do you like this cover? I just get going, and some people find that annoying. But most people are like, really? Like the owner of the store wrote to me after I placed an order?
Right.
You don't get that from the online places. And so we're trying to use technology in a way that's convenient, but also in a way that is humanizing. So our mail order customers feel like they're talking to a real person on the other end. And I don't know if that lack of efficiency is worth it. But for many people, even though it's just a little more complicated to use our website, it's just more humane and more human. And so we're hoping that it's a gesture towards the redemptive use of technology that is not bad, but it does do stuff to you. When you live in a faceless world too long, the stuff to do ends up being habits that end up deforming us as humans. So we're trying to put our little sort of no into the midst of that and do it a different way. So thanks for noticing that. We appreciate it.
It immediately struck me because I'm so used to going to storefronts and seeing like you just click here and it goes into your cart and then you pay for it. But there is no sense of human interaction. And you definitely get that sense of human interaction on your website. So I appreciate your perspective on that. I also want to say that your newsletter is not the typical newsletter at all. So I think I did a word count on your last newsletter and it was like 3,000 words or in that neighborhood. And I was like, wow, we keep trying to make ours shorter. But what I love is when I read your newsletter, which is all about books and your impressions of books and what you're so excited about reading these days. Your newsletter is really about your care for the books and what you think is so valuable about books. And I think your passion for reading comes through loud and clear, and it actually increases my enthusiasm for reading. But I wonder if you can give me your perspective about what's so important about reading a book.
Oh my, well, books go back in Western culture and in Christian history a long, long time. You even think, now granted it was God's word, but you think how in the Old Testament after the exile, they had lost the Torah scrolls and so forth. And during Nehemiah or whatever, Ezra and those guys are rebuilding the destroyed Jerusalem after exile. And they find the scrolls. And I almost imagine like those famous scenes of people digging through the refuse after 9/11 in lower Manhattan, where you're just digging through all this junk and trying to rebuild. And then they find these books, they find these scrolls, and they immediately stop what they're doing. Even though they're rebuilding God's city and rebuilding the temple, they stop and have this huge Sunday school class. They talk about the books that they found because they missed them so long. I mean, this is not just incidental, that Jesus is called the Word, that God in God's image in the very beginning in Genesis 1 creates Adam and Eve in God's image. And then shortly thereafter, they're naming the animals. They're using the sciences and the arts. Adam writes a poem to Eve, blood by blood. It's the first sonnet, love sonnet. Shakespeare did not invent that. Adam did. So right out of the gate, the arts and the sciences are being used, and language is part of who we are, and stories begin to be told, and things get written down eventually. And so this notion that then Jesus shows up as the second Adam and is called the Word, the printed page has always mattered to Christians. So reading and studying and learning and being an apprentice to Jesus implies that there's content to be learned. There's lots of ways to learn. There's experiential education, of course. We can overdo the rational notion of the kind of idea bank where you just dump facts and data into people's heads and that makes them a better person. No, no, no. But the slow engagement with texts is always part of the slow, careful sanctification process of God's people. And so you have a book like Celebration of Discipline, say by Richard Foster, that came out so many years ago, but a classic description of the medieval and contemplative practices that transform people's souls against the superficial ways of the culture. And one of the spiritual disciplines is study. Spending time reading and meditating on words, the gospel and the scriptures, of course, but other things. I mean, Paul at the end of his life is ordering books, the last letter, he wants to get to Spain, but he never makes it. He's in jail in Rome, and he writes one of his last letters to young Timothy, and he orders the manuscripts and the scrolls.
Oh, wow.
We know Paul read widely. I mean, on Acts 17, he's quoting Euripides or whatever great playwright was on this art installation there. He was idolatrous, but he goes out and he builds a bridge with them by saying, I know that poem.
Yes.
And I know what it means. You're searching for God. And at the end of Acts 17, they say, won't you come back and talk about with us again tomorrow? And so Paul read widely, even the pagan literature of his day. I mean, he was listening to the Taylor Swift and the Lupe Fiasco, the hip hop and the country ballads of our culture, the storytellers of our culture. Paul would have known that stuff because he knew the Euripides of his day and quoted it and used it in an apologetic way to build a bridge there in Acts 17. Well, you know all that. But
I don't know all of that.
they're important in the scriptures and they're important in church history. And Paul himself, who written the New Testament, had every reason to sit back on his laurels and say, okay, I've written the Bible now. I don't have to really know anything more. But even as an old man about to die in jail, he's ordering books.
Yes.
And not from Amazon, by the way.
No.
So I think books are important as a way to just carry on the tradition of learning and growing and deepening in our apprenticeship. I'll say the second thing, though. Books are also important. It's not just like the data that you learn from a nonfiction book. I think books most fundamentally shape our imagination. Particularly good memoirs, good fiction, good poetry can just not give us new data to learn, although that's part of it, but they shape kind of call it your worldview, if you will, or your social imagination, the way in which you sort of lean into life, the vocabulary and rhetoric and grammar of fiction. Yeah. And so imagining the possibility of God's kingdom, of a God-haunted world that we live in, can happen when our imaginations are expanded. And I think books do that. Reading widely is one of the things we often say here, whether you agree with a book or not, but the fact that you've sort of submitted yourself to it for a season. I mean, I think in a way books can make you can puff you up. That's a danger. But it also can make you more humble because for a while you've said, life is not about me. It's about this author, about this story. You suspend disbelief and enter somebody else's story. So page by page, you're entering and submitting to a story other than your own. And that's a good virtue, I think, to have, to be able to sort of suspend your own self-centeredness and give yourself to the page. Agree or not, at the end of the day, you come out a better person at the end because you've allowed that conversation to go on. So I believe books are apprenticeship to discipleship, but they're also sort of an act of formation by giving you this expanded imagination, if you will. Does that make sense?
It makes a huge amount of sense. I also think of how sometimes when I'm reading something, I'll have that aha moment. Like I've met somebody who I could sit down and have a cup of coffee with, and we would have much more in common than I would ever have imagined, right? Yeah. Somebody from a completely different background from me may speak some words that I need to particularly hear at that particular moment, right? Or it's like reading a psalm or a scripture where the psalmist is able to articulate a moment of pain or suffering or a question to God that I myself would love to articulate, but maybe haven't given myself permission to. So that type of resonance that happens when I'm reading something that is really just timely. And in some ways, I sometimes think it's God ordained that I have that moment and that sense of, I'm not alone in this experience that I'm having.
Yep.
So very powerful.
I often say that books give voice to things that maybe we in our own limitedness can't come up with on our own. And God has given the gift of even the common grace to non-believers, giving them the ability to articulate things, to write songs, and poems, and stories. And so I'll say to my wife sometimes, that's that paragraph right there. That's what I was trying to say. Like, I'm not smart enough to say it, but somebody else put it into words. I'm like, they can give voice for us and go, yeah, that's what I was trying to say. That's what I meant. Between the lines of that author is now my friend because they've said what I've tried to say or what I feel, and they do it so well in their own way. I've read people say that, like, particularly when they're maybe going through hard times and they read another story of someone that's gone through similar hard times. You said you're not alone. Absolutely. And they say, that person is almost my best friend, this fictional character. They understand me better than anybody I know. And of course, we need good friends and we need community and we need spiritual directors and we need pastors and so forth, of course. But sometimes a fictional character can be your friend and can give voice to stuff going on in your own life. So, yeah, that's what I mean by books can help open up our imagination and make us just more full as people, and God can use those in his grace, can use those things in our lives. I'll tell you something else. You folks up there in Madison, I used to work in campus ministry myself years ago. You're working with college students, with graduate students, with faculty. You're doing such a good work there. And I know you've had this theme around being a good neighbor, just what it means to be neighborly in a complex, pluralistic, busy world, even technology. You've studied a bit. I'll tell you what, books can make us more empathetic.
Oh,
and
they
the
can.
research on that is pretty universal. They've done research for years in American culture about readers, and they find that people that read are more empathetic than people that don't. And it's putting yourself in somebody else's shoes for a while, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. You, again, see life through a different angle, and you come away, not always, but more often than not, readers become more empathetic. In fact, there's a book. Am I allowed to show a book? Can I do my advertising thing?
Yes, absolutely.
Here's a book by Mary McCampbell, which I just adore. It's published by Fortress Press. You maybe have had her on the podcast even at some point. Imagining our neighbors as ourselves, how art shapes empathy. Now, Mary teaches literature, and part of what she means by art here is less visual art, but narrative art. So she means TV shows and movies, novels and short stories, plays, rock songs. And so she explores how narratives, novels and poems and music can tell a story and thereby make you more empathetic. The first chapter is on this Good Samaritan story, and it's one of the best things I've read in the preface here, talking about the empathy that emerges in the Good Samaritan story. And then she asks whether viewing good movies and watching good TV shows and engaging good novels, whether this narrative arc of a story can actually make us more empathetic. I think it's a splendid book for those that love reading because it's a book about books, but it's also for those that want to dive deeper into this question of what it means to be a good neighbor. Can we even imagine that our neighbor is somehow a person made in God's image that we should care for and sometimes speak up for questions of justice? So this is a great little book great big book, actually, heavy, thoughtful, right up the line of you guys up there at Upper House.
I'm thrilled that you brought that forward because I have not heard of that. And we will definitely put that in the show notes so people can refer to it.
He was doing a workshop up at the Calvin Festival of Faith and Writing where we were just a month ago. And so she was up there doing a workshop on this very stuff then. Guys like Makoto Fujimura, Mako has a blurb in the back of this. Karen Swallow Pryor, who's people, and Jessica Hooten Wilson, who I have some of her books here as well on loving God by reading well. They've all raved about this. How narrative can make us better neighbors.
Well, and think about all of the stories that Jesus told. And the way the Bible has so many narratives that help us identify with a particular individual in a story. We may, for example, you brought up the prodigal son. We may identify with the young son who took all the father's treasure and went away. Or we may identify with the older son who's resentful when he comes back and gets the big party and celebration. Or we may identify with the father, depending on where we are at in life. It's these narratives are so powerful. And actually, I'm really glad you brought up the other writer that you mentioned. Was it Mary Hooten? What's her last name?
Wilson.
Thank you. Yeah. If you want to talk about the number of books that we were thinking about for recommendations for summer reading for some of our listeners, I would love to just dive right into all of that.
There are, in our latest Book Notes newsletter, I had a little announcement of a handout I did at a workshop I recently did with pastors about reading more widely. And it was about 6, depending on the type size, about 10 pages of novels. So if you open that up, you can find novels or memoirs or even creative nonfiction really well. But I started off that Book Notes newsletter, and I really hope some of your listeners, because they are good readers, because they are many academics, they might get a real kick out of these kind of books. And I'll start with the Jessica Hooten Wilson ones. She has a book called The Scandal of Holiness. The subtitle is Renewing Your Imagination in the Company of Literary Saints. I adore this book. And she invites people to just spend time with good books. You know, the old pastor Eugene Peterson, he's known for The Message, but also for writing Presbyterian books about being a good clergy person. No glitz, no drama, just down to earth, caring for people's souls. And he was a big fan of pastors and others reading well regularly. And he found that he was always being distracted. So in his office, he would tell his secretary every day at like 2:00, he would say, well, just tell them I'm with someone. And who he was with was the author. If he said he was reading a book, you know, people would say, oh, that doesn't matter. And he would get interrupted all the time. So he said he was with James Joyce, or he was with Karl Barth, or he was with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So he was reading novels, and he ordered books from us. He was fiercely loyal to our bookstore. And he would send us orders for Russian novels and Irish poets and, contemporary playwrights. I mean, it was amazing the stuff that Eugene read. But he would say he was with someone because that was his built-in time to study well. Well, she invites us to do that. And in fact, in the beginning of this book, she says it's really interesting when you read a memoir of one of the great converts of the 20th century that we know and love is C.S. Lewis. And in his Surprised by Joy, he doesn't talk about his conversion that much. You know, he says, I got in a motorcycle with my friend, or a train, and some stories with Warney, his brother. And when he got to the destination, he was a Christian. He wasn't when he started, and he was when he was over. So his conversion story isn't all that dramatic or spelled out. And people want to know, how did you get there? Well, the whole book is about his love for literature and how it shaped his imagination. He even used the phrase that his imagination was baptized by George MacDonald. And so once his imagination could imagine that there's a God in the world who cares for us, that these myths could be true, that the sorrow and suffering in this world could be redemptive. Once he could kind of wrap his head around that, then deciding that Jesus was that God was sort of easy stuff. The biggest question was breaking away from the secularism of the early 20th century and sneaking past those watchful dragons, as he put it, to an imagination that there was God. And so she says in here that that's the goal, even with C.S. Lewis, of books, that they can help our imagination. And then the conversion part and the apologetics part is sort of comes on the heels of that. So she invites us to keep company with good literary saints, she calls them. Well, then after she did that, she wrote another book called Reading for the Love of God. She actually kind of gives you a guide to how to read, what it means to read thoughtfully, carefully, spiritually. And she uses some case studies in here, like Flannery O'Connor or other people from church history. I think she uses Augustine as one of them. Oh, she has one on Frederick Douglass, a chapter on Frederick Douglass. Oh, wow. She has a chapter on Julian of Norwich, the medieval mystic. And each of these people that she has these little kind of interludes about read somewhat differently. They approached the text somewhat differently. They read sort of differently. She has Dorothy Sayers, C.S. Lewis's friend, in here as a case study. So you have Dorothy Sayers' manner of reading. You have Frederick Douglass' style of reading. You have Julian of Norwich's approach to reading. So you literally learn how to read for the love of God. The subtitle is How to Read as a Spiritual Practice. But again, Jessica is just a gem She's a Dorothy Sayers scholar and has just released a book on Dorothy Sayers'
Oh,
previous
wow.
published work, which nobody has touched in 50 years. And she
Right.
got a hold of this unfinished manuscript and sort of put some meat to it and described it. And so that's out too by her. That's a fun read.
I'm going to have to read that. I'll order it from you, by the way, but I'm going to have to read that because I'm a huge Dorothy Sayers fan. Just amazed by her brilliance, just from everything from her mysteries to her other material.
Yep.
So, you also mentioned Nourishing Narratives, the Power of Story to Shape Our Faith.
That is by Jennifer Holberg, who teaches over at Calvin University. For those of you up in the Midwest, you know Calvin in Grand Rapids, and they do this Festival of Faith and Writing every other year, which is just the high point of the year for many of us book lovers, writers, and poetry lovers, and all sorts of folks. And she directs that as well. So Jennifer's been at this a long time. She's a literature professor, and she makes the case in this book that we live our lives by story. The narrative is the way the Bible develops. It's the way God has spoken to us. And it's the way our lives tend to make sense. Some of us know McIntyre, the ethicist that wrote the book on virtue a good number of years ago. And again, the meaning of a word and what you're to do, the ethics of what you're to do, only is dependent first on what story you're a part of, he says. So understanding the narrative and the worldviews that emerge from narrative is part of the agenda of this book. And then to put it more simply, it's to help us fall in love with literature. She quotes literature and stories and poems that she has taught well over the years, authors that she's enjoyed, but she frames it in terms of how these narratives, both biblical and other literature, can shape our lives. Nourishing Narratives, The Power of Story to Shape Our Faith by Holberg. I just think it's a gem. It's enjoyable. Anybody that's bookish at all will see themselves in it and will learn something. I'm sure it's a great book that a book club could read together over the summer. It's not like literary criticism that is so arcane and deconstructing all the language. There's a little literary criticism there, but it's more just an enjoyable read about the power of stories. I love that book. Yep, I really do.
I actually met her when I was at the Festival of Faith and Writing and enjoyed her so enormously. Just so down to earth.
She really is. And there's a lot. She loves students. And I'll tell you what, it's sort of along those lines. Can I tell you about another one that's new? I announced this from the stage when I was doing, in fact, Jennifer was interviewing me at the festival in an auditorium with some other readers. And this book was not out yet. But I knew it was coming. I had an advance copy and I loved it. So I said, you should be looking for this book. Here, the author was like in the audience, one of the authors. And so I sort of embarrassed myself. But it's called Deep Reading.
That was one I wanted to ask you about. Yes.
Practices to subvert the vices of our distracted, hostile, and consumeristic age. It's by three women, Rachel Griffiths, Julie Ohms, and Rachel Smith Roberts. What's interesting about these three women, they're all Christian college professors, is they all got their PhDs, I'm guessing under Ralph Wood, at Baylor. So they're Baylor PhDs, recent young college professors, and they found, particularly within Christian higher education and within the consortium of study centers, there's a lot of conversation about the integration of faith and learning. What does it look like to actually think Christianly and to engage with a worldview that is deeply biblical, but yet engaging the best science and art that's out there? Well, as you think about the integration of faith and learning, one of the things that comes up is there has not been enough study about reading as one of the practices that help us engage Christianly. And so this book is less about what we read, making lists of what are the best books, but literally how we read. It's not unlike that Jessica Hooten Wilson book, or Reading for the Love of God. It's sort of the next level up after that of asking. And one of the things they say is that as you become a reader, as you submit yourself to the practice of reading books, you have the tools to be subversive to the idols of the culture. In other words, you can no longer necessarily, you can fight back against the distraction of our culture, against the hostility, because you're reading people you may not agree with, and you learn to dialogue and keep the open page as you read a kind of hermeneutics of hospitality, if you will. Some of the postmodern critics talk about a hermeneutic of suspicion. You're always wondering, what's the author really saying? And what's between the line? And what are they trying to manipulate us into believing? They suggest that we need a hermeneutic of hospitality.
Yes.
That the author for a season can be our friend, and we should be generous and open to learn what we have and take the book on its own face value rather than being ultimately a critic of it. We should receive it, which is an old C.S. Lewis line. You know, in the Experiments of Criticism from C.S. Lewis, he says the goal isn't to analyze a book at first, but it's to receive it. Isn't that beautiful that we receive the gift of the printed word? And so if we have a hospitality motif going on, then our reading of the book will allow us to be open to others. So we learn the virtues of resisting hostility in our culture. We resist the distraction of devices. And finally, they say that the consumerism of our age, we're not just trying to buy an idea. We don't just absorb an idea. We've received the text. We haven't used it. And, you know, some of us want to use ideas. And like Lewis, we say we receive them first. So we resist the pragmatism and the consumerism of this idea that we're just buying an idea to fight a battle in the culture. So I adore this book. It's a little deeper, and it invites us to what they call deep reading. I hope they're right, that we readers, as we attend to these practices, actually come out the other side as people that can say no to the worst of our culture, to the hostility of the cultural wars, to the consumerism of capitalism, and to the distraction of the internet age. Yeah, maybe these books can really help us do that.
I was really struck by the hermeneutics of hospitality. That is a very compelling idea. And when I think about the polarization that we're struggling with in our culture, a lot of us are going into conversations or into engagements with the sense of, do I need to be on my guard? So that's like our stance almost by default in some situations. Whereas I was raised in a time that was less polarized in some ways, but with the idea that my job to go into a conversation is to ask questions, to try to understand the other person, to kind of hopefully make them feel like I actually care about them.
Yeah.
And so what you're suggesting is taking that same approach to reading books and thinking about ideas, which to me is very freeing. Yeah. And I think about what my daughter, who's 19, reads, and she reads really deep material. I'm amazed at the old mythologies and the language, intricate language that she reads and everything. But I think when I was learning how to read in school, it was mostly with that idea of consuming facts, right? Yeah. That's what we're taught in school. And I think we're invited to something more, and that you're showing us some books that help us to go further. Yeah.
And I don't want to say, just parenthetically, that we dare not be, the discernment is a bad thing. Obviously, we need discernment. And obviously, we shouldn't be led around by the nose by every ideology that comes upon us. And so the scriptures say to take every thought captive, every theory, take theories captive. So there is a sense of spiritual warfare when you careful. But we start with receiving it. I think Lewis was right. The deep reading posture is a hermeneutic of hospitality and openness, that this is a person made in God's image that has a story to tell. And we should host them as if we love them, as if we're being a good neighbor to that author. So that's what I want to do. And it's hard. You're right. There's goofy stuff out there. There's dangerous stuff out there. And these days with conspiracy theories and all that, we have to learn the art of doing this well. And I think reading these books about books helps us get there. There's a brand new book that I'm very, very excited about. It's not about reading, but it's called Beauty is Oxygen.
I saw that.
So it's by Wesley Vanderloot. He runs a creative arts program at Gordon Conwell Seminary, of all places, where they want to increasingly have theologians that are studying doctrine also be influenced by the creative storytellers. And this guy really gets it. I think it's his first kind of trade book that's out there for the world. And it is on literature, it's on the arts, it's on creativity, it's on the imagination. And I think he's right. Beauty is oxygen. But unlike many authors, they use that phrase from Dostoevsky that says beauty will save the world, which I've never quite fully understood Jesus.
Okay.
But the next line in that story is what kind of or what sort of beauty the one character has. Sort of beauty could be saving. And he plays around with that phrase from the same Dostoevsky paragraph. What sort of beauty could be redemptive in our lives? And what does that look like? So again, this notion that we need to expand our imagination through good books in part has to do with the whole imagination and the aesthetic dimension of life. I mean, guys like Calvin Servo have written about that over the years, where we realize that it is not all just facts and data being dumped into our brain, but something multifaceted, holistic going on. Dorothy Sayers understood that. Lewis understood that. Nicholas Wolkersdorf and modern guys writing about aesthetics like Calvin Servo. And now comes along this guy, brand new book just this week. And I am thrilled that there are authors that are kind of inviting us to that sort of bigger picture of what it means to be human.
Wondering about this tide of books that's coming out on this topic. Do you think the writers are writing in recognition of the need that we have to be reminded of what it is to really read deeply? I mean, I think if you think about most of our culture with text and limited character messages, I wonder if they're trying to say, but don't miss out on what's possible if you really dive into a text and allow it to speak to you, almost like a Lectio Divina type of experience.
I think you're right. I think that there is sort of a concern, and it may be intentional for some of these friends, or at least it's between the lines bubbling up in their bones, that there's something going on in our culture with the emphasis of texts, which may be causing some psychological problems, the anxiety we're seeing because of spending too much time online, but also sort of the misuse of text. Do you remember years ago, there was a book back in the 80s called Amusing Ourselves?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I remember that.
Oh my, what a book. But he looked at the Great Awakening and the theology that emerged, and people that weren't well educated would listen to sermons that were rich and thoughtful for hours and then fall down in the spirit weeping, not because they were manipulated with cheesy ideas, but because of the substance of the ideas. He compares that with modern televangelism, and it does not look well. Then he looks at the Douglas debates. You know, people, ordinary farmers and stuff would go listen to hours as Lincoln and Douglas went on the road and did these debates, quoting John Locke and all this stuff about political philosophy. And ordinary, uneducated people would listen to that. And then he says, nowadays, you have sound bites. And you have political consultants asking the candidates when they go to debate what color tie they should wear.
Right.
You know? And he says, what happens to your religious culture when you move from the Great Awakening to an entertainment model, or our political culture when you go from the Lincoln Douglas debates to modern sound bites? And so this amusing ourselves to death. Well, that was the concern about the loss of text, big time, when popular culture began to sort of shorten our attention span. Well, if that was 25 years ago, what the heck now?
Right.
With the internet, you've got guys like Nicholas Carr, who wrote a book, The Shallows, which I think everybody should read, but it's about the neurology of what happens in the brain when you read with pixels. Nicholas Carr was a literary critic. He wrote book reviews for the Los Angeles Times. So he read highbrow fiction, long stories, deep stories. And he found, this was maybe a dozen years ago or so, he found that he couldn't keep reading the books. It was his job and his love. And he found something fishy, and he realized it's because he read short texts on blogs and on Twitter. And he wrote this article in The Atlantic called, Is Google Making Us Dumb? And he said, yes, literally, neurologically, we need to figure this out. So he put himself to the task of trying to figure that out. You can hook things up to people's eyeballs and study neurology and the way in which people scan pages when they're reading a printed page versus when they're reading something on pixels, on digital devices. And he says there is a neurological difference in the reading experience when you have a real page versus when you're reading something on Twitter. So
that's fascinating.
For a while, and wrote a book about it called The Shallows. What Google is literally doing to our brains. So I use Google and I read online all the time. It's part of my job. But this warning that we need a different kind of encounter with books just may be the reason why so many Christian authors now are writing about reading because
Yeah.
we're at a pivotal point in our culture where it's just going downhill. People aren't reading as much. People aren't buying books as much. Bookstores are having a harder time with it.
Yes.
So, yeah, I think it's interesting that all these books are coming out now on reading.
And I'm like a magpie with books. I love books. Sometimes I buy them just because I like them so much, and my aspiration is to read them all the way through, but I have found it harder for me to finish books. And I'm wondering if there's any connection with maybe the distraction that we're talking about being part of it. But I wonder if part of it is also that I'm on a screen so much and it's affected my ability to attend. It's just a question I need to pursue for myself. I have no data to support that. Are there any other books that you want to share with us today, Byron? I mean, you've covered quite a bit, and I do want to...
How much time do we have? Yeah.
I can give you 5 more minutes on a book, and then we're going to close.
Oh, my goodness. Well, I'll tell you just a thing or two. With this notion of being a good neighbor and reading widely because you want to care for your neighbor well, and you've been studying this hospitality stuff, there comes a time in many of our lives, whether it's our reading lives or our loving our neighbor lives, when we just get tired. We can't keep on keeping on. And so the more you envelop your life in loving neighbors, which is messy, or reading books, you learn more about the nature of the world. We begin to ask the question, at least many of us do, how can I, knowing what I know now, how the sausage is really made, I've read some books about some things now, and I know more stuff. I'm more cynical. I'm more critical. How do you keep on keeping on with the glory of God fresh in your life and the love of neighbor fresh in your life? There is no other author that helps me do that better than my friend Steve Garber, who you had at Upper House over the years. This is a book called Visions of Vocation, in which Steve asks this very question. How can you love the world well in your own place once you've known how broken it really is? Idealistic kids come out of college. They want to make a difference for the kingdom. You give them a sense of vocation at Upper House. You help young faculty, think Christianly about their careers in the arts or the sciences. But sooner or later, the original vision of relating the lordship of Christ to all of life begins to get harder because we're not just talking about the rhetoric of all that now, but now it's like, well, how do you do that? How do you keep at it 25 years in? And Garber's book is exactly about common grace for the common good so that we can keep singing the Lord's song in a foreign land, knowing what we know about the world with a sort of approximate sense of justice. So we can serve God. We're never going to build the kingdom. We're not utopian, but yet we can keep at it. I adore this book. It's well written. If somebody has not read it in your community up there and any of your listeners now, I really recommend Steve Garber's Vision of Vocation. Just as a way to flesh all this stuff out. He quotes novels, he quotes movies, he quotes rock songs. He's all about the narrative. But finally, at the end of the day, he's asking how we read well and wisely so we can love others. Hey, can I tell you about one other quick book real quick? This is a book unlike any book you've ever read, and I'm just so happy to tell you about it. It's there's a guy named...
how could I say no?
Robert Hudson. He was up at the Festival of Faith and Writing. He had a little booth there. He used to be Philip Yancey's editor. I mean, he's a guy in the book publishing world. He's done some eccentric book himself. He's just written this novel. If you can see it here, it's called The Beautiful Madness of Martin Bonham. Martin is a college teacher. He could be at in Wisconsin for all we know.
Okay.
He's at a fictional college, and get this. He's a medieval scholar that teaches the mystics of the Middle Ages. So he gets this student in class one day who just joined his class from across the street where there's a seminary. And she was studying theology and dogma and doctrine, and she just wasn't resonating with it. And she wanted his story of the mystics. Well, she becomes a student in his class, and she said, well, Dr. Bonham, do you have those kind of encounters with God? And he said, well, as a matter of fact, yes. I think there's a difference between knowing about God and knowing God. And she said, well, why don't we talk about that? And they put together a little conference where they asked various faculty members to share ways in which they've had mystical encounters with the real divine presence in their life.
Wow.
it becomes a great thing. And they decide to start a program on this that they call, it's about the study of the love of God. Well, the seminarians across the street get wind of this. And they say, hey, that's our job. You guys aren't authorized to do this. What do you know about theology? This could be dangerous. It becomes sort of a comedy of errors about different departments in the seminary and the college teaching about who's allowed to do this class. And is there a difference between knowing about God and really encountering God? This is a funny book. There's lots of literature in it. He quotes the medieval mystics himself. Martin is a scholar of that field in the story, but really it's trying to get at what is the purpose of education? Right. What does it mean to know stuff? What does it mean to be open to things and to learn and to grow and finally to know God through it all? It's a really funny book. It's published by a little independent outfit. You may not know about it, but I think some of your readers and listeners of your podcast would get a real kick out of this thing. It's a light summer read. And at the end of the day, it's really, really not only hilarious and it's heartwarming. And not only is it heartwarming, I think it's radical.
It sounds fantastic.
Out of epistemology at the end of the day.
I have had so much fun talking to you. I really have. I'm so glad we're going to be doing this again. You have graciously agreed to do this kind of podcast with me every 3 months or so. And I honestly am so energized by your passion for books and for these recommendations that you bring to us today. So thank you. Thank you for your time.
Enthusiasm means a lot to me as a bookseller here in Central Pennsylvania. Thank you. And
You're welcome.
Good listeners and good people doing the good work up there in Madison. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Well, we're definitely going to put more about all that you've talked about onto our show notes. And also, I want to mention you have a podcast. So do you want to briefly tell our audience what your podcast is?
Oh, it's a short little thing some friends of mine got me to do. They interview me and say, tell me about 3 books. And in just a couple of minutes, it's about 15 minutes or so, I just say 3 books. Sometimes they're related, sometimes they're not. We're still sort of getting our sea legs doing it. It was going to be once a month, but another guy's going to interview me on every other week. So it's now going to be twice a month. And we drop them every couple of weeks. And it's just me going on about a couple of books.
We'll mention that in our show notes too, so people can find you there too.
It's kind of fun.
Yeah, I can believe that. Well, thank you so much for being with me today, Byron. I really appreciate it. And we'll look forward to you next time. Okay.
Thank you very, very much.
You're welcome.